Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And in today's episode we will be talking about Elle, the movie by Paul Verhoeven starring Oscar-nominated Isabelle Huppert. Also English Tapas, the new album by English shouty men Sleaford Mods. And we'll be looking at Alastair's recommendation from last time, which was Heat, the 90s crime movie directed by Michael Mann starring De Niro and Pacino, which would have been a big deal in the 90s. Fans of maths will note that that's only 3 items rather than the usual 4, and that is because our 4th item for this episode was Logan, which we covered in its own special episode, which we released I think about a week and a half ago. So yeah, if you scroll back in your feed or on our website, you can find MFV 30, which features us talking about Logan with special guest Chris Brosnahan, with a little bit of side chat about Twin Peaks, Jerusalem by Alan Moore, and of course my beloved Spider-Man clone saga. It was good. It was a very good little guest episode. Very nice to finally get Chris on the show. And
I enjoyed it. I think we had a good chat.
So yeah, it was good. If you didn't get that one because you only check the Moderate Fantasy Violence feed every 2 weeks on the dot, no exceptions, then I would recommend maybe going back and finding MFV 30. It will also explain to you why we've gone from MFV 29 to 31 in the last 2 weeks. So anyway, this is MFV 31, and before we get on to the things I listed, Alastair, what have you been experiencing since the last episode, not quite 2 weeks ago?
I've been listening to and reading some poetry.
Wow.
This is Kate Tempest, sort of Lewisham-based, I guess, sort of performance poet, writer, rapper, I guess you could say. She's definitely a writer who blurs different mediums into one sort of performance. Yeah, because she's released 2 albums that are, available on Spotify and Amazon and, iTunes and the rest of it. The first album's called Everybody Down. The second one is called Let Them Eat Chaos. Full marks for excellent album titles. And they do enjoy a good album title. As a side note, possibly my favourite album title of all time is Hardcore Will Never Die, But You Will, from Mogwai. That's just a nice aside for anyone who's interested in what the greatest album title of all time is. Yeah, Kate Tempest. So the albums are sort of, I guess, a bit more like rapping, but there's sort of spoken word poetry bits. There's synths and things going on in the background, not too dissimilar to Sleaford Mods that we'll come to in a bit, but it's quite stark and minimalist. There are definitely some tracks on her albums that is just her, I guess, reading poetry or talking poetry. And I've also been reading her epic poem that she published called Brand New Ancients.
What's her work actually about?
Oh, yeah. So it's kind of like modern, I guess it's sort of just observations of the sort of small things of modern life. They're usually just about fairly inconsequential everyday people and their everyday struggles. For example, the album Let Them Eat Chaos is about this row of flats, and each track or poem is about a different person in the flat and their life. Some of them are like poor people driven out of London by property price rises. Some are people who are very, very successful but possibly find their life a bit soulless. Some are people who just live for booze and drugs, but isn't really sure if there's more to life than this. Some are people dealing with loss. Brand New Ancients, which I'm reading now, is this sort of story about this, I guess, kid from it's got lots of different, brings in lots of different things. But mainly it's about this kid who wants to be a comics writer he's from a sort of broken home. When he's young, he puts all his feelings into writing comics, and he sort of gets some success, but then sort of starts working in advertising, starts making money, gets swept up in that, then grows to question it. I think a lot of it's about everyday life and sort of everyday struggles. She's got a brilliant knack for, observing those tiny little things that everyone does that seem so human, the kind of little peppering of detail onto her writing that makes it seem really realistic.
Yeah, fair enough. If she's from down Lewisham Way, then presumably somewhere in the area where I live. I'm assuming she doesn't talk in detail about getting the DLR from Lewisham Station and other universal Lewisham experiences.
Sadly, the Lewisham DLR has yet to appear.
The other week, a man was sprayed in the face with a corrosive substance outside Lewisham DLR. Surely there's a poem in that.
Yeah, that is definitely a slice of gritty urban living.
But I don't know if that's what she wants from her work, whether there was a lot of, I came out of the DLR and then a man threw bleach in my face. Oh dear.
Ouch.
It burned.
Yeah, that's...
that didn't even rhyme. Does her poetry rhyme, or is this not from the rhyming end of poetry?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely rhymes and stuff, and she's got a very broad sort of East London accent. She sounds very East London. You couldn't mistake where she's from by listening to the albums.
Oh, so she's a tourist in the Lewisham area.
Tempest grew up in Brockley, southeast London,
Brockley.
Yeah,
That's down the road, isn't it? That's a sort of a sub area of Lewisham.
So yeah, it's part of the borough of Lewisham, as opposed to, I don't know, the shining hub of Lewisham itself.
Yeah, let's not sugarcoat it. I know the listeners can't actually see it, but there's a lot of takeaway, a lot of concrete, and a lot of people having acid thrown in their face.
Yeah, so if you find that intriguing, I highly recommend checking out some Kate Tempest. Anyway, Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Since we last spoke, I have watched the first couple of episodes of Riverdale, a new and somewhat buzzy show from the CW network in the States, which is basically a sort of updating of the Archie characters into a sort of modern teen drama setting, and then plunging them into a sort of Twin Peaks vibe.
Oh, that's an interesting array of influences.
Yeah, I mean, it 'tis the year to do Twin Peaks stuff, I guess. But yeah, I mean, the Archie characters are a strange one in that a lot of people in Britain, I think, haven't really heard of them unless they're like me and have spent a lot of time but really immersed in American culture and following American people on Twitter and so on. They're very sort of Americana. They're very sort of something I think was quite big among a certain sort of 40s, 50s generation of Americans growing up, and has become this sort of corny classic thing. But yeah, it's now reached a stage where the Archie brand as a whole, brand commentary, oh yes, seems to have had a bit of a resurgence in the last like 5-10 years by basically taking the well-known nature of its characters and plunging them into slightly different genres. Like there's been a comic called Afterlife with Archie, where Archie, Betty and Veronica and the gang fight zombies.
Yeah, the only reason why I know about Archie is because they make jokes about them in The Simpsons. They're one of those like very American things that you kind of, I guess, British people only find out through like bleeding through into other culture. They're mentioned in like Friends as well and things like that. So it's only from these like other things that reference them that I've really heard of them.
Well, yeah, it's sort of, I guess it's meant to be a sort of very wholesome American high school setup that shows like The Simpsons are sort of reacting against, I guess. But yeah, Riverdale specifically is the new CW teen drama series, which imagines the Archie characters as sort of young, sexy, modern teen drama characters, and then gives them a sort of Twin Peaks-esque murder happening around them. And I mean, the Twin Peaks comparison is very rare visually, although in terms of content, so far it's mostly so far based on the 2 episodes I've seen, and I think they have aired like 6 or 7 and also renewed it for a second season, so this does seem to be a thing. Based on the 2 episodes I've seen, it's a very nicely shot teen drama with a murder in it, but there hasn't yet been any like undercurrents of the supernatural, but I'm hoping it's coming.
No backwards talking dwarfs.
No, although in Archie do also own the character Sabrina the Teenage Witch, so I'm hoping they'll unveil a supernatural element related to the involvement of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, because certainly in Afterlife with Archie, where they fight the zombies are caused because one of Archie's friend's dog dies, and he takes it to Sabrina the Teenage Witch and begs her to resurrect it, and of course Sabrina brings the dog back from the dead, and in doing so unleashes zombies upon the world.
There's a trend for these kind of slightly meta, sort of modern reinterpretations of these sort of classic children's things, but for grown-ups. I mean, a few years ago, I really liked that show, Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, which was, they took Birdman, who was a superhero from a 60s cartoon called Birdman and the Galaxy Trio, and they kind of updated him to the present day, said that he was a lawyer working in New York. And Birdman was a Hanna-Barbera property, so all of Birdman's clients were other Hanna-Barbera characters. So they had, I don't know, like the Flintstones were, for some reason, were involved in some kind of mafia-based thing. They had Secret Squirrel was arrested for flashing at one point. Which was quite funny. They had the Jetsons coming back from the future to sue the past over mismanagement of the environment.
Nice.
It was things. Yeah, it was all very knowing jokes about these sort of classic characters. I think the Scooby-Doo people got arrested for drugs possession or something.
Well, yeah, the Scooby-Doo cast were always obviously quite stoned, especially Shaggy. Okay, and first up this week and a half, whatever, we will be discussing Elle, the new movie directed by Paul Verhoeven and starring, as I said earlier, Isabelle Huppert, who was nominated for an Oscar for her role in this film, and deservedly so, as she's very good. But before I get into the further description of it, I guess a small content warning for anyone who's sensitive about this sort of thing. This film concerns itself very heavily with sexual assault. The inciting incident is a sexual assault. It's flashback to repeatedly. We probably can't talk about this film without, at least to some degree, talking around the concept of sexual assault. So if that particularly upsets you, then feel free to go to our show notes and find the timestamp that lets you flash forward to our Sleaford Mods discussion. So anyway, yes, following on, I guess, from that content warning, Elle is a film about a character called Michelle, played by Huppert, who is violently sexually assaulted in her home by a masked intruder. Those are literally the opening moments of the film. It's very much setting out its stall there. And following the rape, she proceeds to deal with it in her own distinctive style, which both does and doesn't play into what you'd expect. It's a very, very odd film, and as the film goes on, we dig further into Michelle's past, because she has a slightly odd background, which we probably don't need to spoil, I don't think. But anyway, we'll get into that. She has some strange things going on in her family. She has an odd relationship with her best friend. And it's basically a character study of this specific character, the woman, Elle, if you like. And yeah, when I first heard about how it was a film about basically a woman dealing with her rape, I was expecting... I don't know about you, Alastair, I was expecting something quite different from what I got.
Yeah, I agree with that. This isn't necessarily what I thought it was going to be about. I mean, partly because it's directed by Paul Verhoeven, who's done a lot of sort of quite like violent and gritty films. I mean, there was certainly the violence of the several rapes that occur in the film was done really intense and in a really shocking way. I don't know, the plot didn't go in the direction I thought it was going to go, and I thought it would be a much more straightforward revenge film when it wasn't so much. It's a slightly strange thing in that the first half definitely kind of goes in the direction you think it's going to go in, which is that like she's sort of hunting for the man who raped her, ostensibly to take revenge on him. There's a plot twist, I guess we don't need to spoil, why she can't go to the police, or feels that she can't go to the police. So there's her investigating and trying to track down the man himself. Then it kind of goes in an odd direction. There's a revelation at the end of Act 2 when you sort of find out who the rapist is. Now, at that point I thought it would proceed to the revenge part in the final act, but the final act seems to be like almost like a different film when main character Elle has this sort of, I guess, edgy affair with the man who raped her. And I didn't really get what they were trying to do with this like sort of second bit. It really felt like two different films. It became a different film after the mystery was solved. And I didn't think that the two films worked particularly well together because I wasn't really sure what they were trying to achieve other than just being dark and edgy. I mean, that's not to say it's a bad film. I mean, it was very intense. It was quite shocking. It was well directed. Isabelle Huppert is phenomenal in this role, really brings her character to life. Great performance. It's well directed, it's well written, there's lots of interesting characters that are well developed, but I just felt that like the direction it went later in the film, I didn't find quite confusing. I didn't really understand where it was going.
Yeah, I mean, my first bullet point note is weird fucking film, so yes. As I say, I went in there expecting something a bit more sort of somewhere between a sort of psychological profile of a survivor and maybe a sort of revenge thriller, and instead, for a lot of it, it's sort of this slightly weird dark comedy. Whereas, I mean, there's a lot of scenes which are largely just played for laughs. I mean, Isabelle Huppert goes straight from the initial rape scene to basically going and delivering sort of withering one-liners to her son and her friends and her son and her son and her son. This is a woman who is sometimes quite cruel to her son.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about this film is it has a lot of subplots. I mean, there's like loads, there's like a plot with her best friend, there's a plot with her son, there's a plot with her mother, there's a plot about her father, there's a plot about her work, there's a plot about her best friend's husband that she's sort of having an affair with, there's a plot about her neighbour, and all these plots are handled really, really well and balanced. It doesn't get too confusing, but some of them are pretty much, like you say, played for laughs. Like the plot about her son and her mother are quite funny, which tonally is really odd in a film that's core substance is about rape and revenge. So yeah, there was something tonally that didn't quite work there.
No, I think it did work to the extent that it felt like a realistic or at least viable look into this specific person, in that, you know, it didn't feel like her life was defined by this one horrible thing that happened to her. She just sort of had to go on with it, and because she's been dealing with a lot of stuff since early in life, you know, I mean, the things... Again, I guess we've established we're going to dance around the spoiler because I don't think there's much to be gained from actually saying it. But she has dealt with some quite horrible, not just like, oh dear, my dog's dead, but properly unpleasant things from quite early in her life, which I think is meant to go some way towards explaining why she's able to just pick up after her own rape and just basically carry on as if nothing's happened. Or at least, well... It's not quite that straightforward. There are a few quite nicely deployed moments where she does sort of come close to breaking down over it as you might sort of expect. But a lot of the time, she's just clearly very much, I'm going to get up and get on with it.
Yeah, she doesn't want to tell people. I don't think she doesn't want to tell her son or her mother what's happened, so which is understandable. So she continues to be the sort of withering mother full of put-downs and the sort of person who's eternally disappointed in the antics of her mother, who is, an older woman who's having a fling with a younger man who really looks like a French Danny Dyer.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is anchored around Isabelle Huppert. I mean, I don't think it's a massive exaggeration to say that if she hadn't had her or someone as good as her in the main role, this film would probably have been a disaster, or at least a slightly confusing mess. Yeah,
you're right there.
The fact that she makes it all seem like it's one coherent thing, like she is always acting, and there was like every twitch of her face she does manage to convey the fact that she's dealing with this genuine trauma at the same time as she's going about her business, doing her job. It does go into sort of slightly dark comedy territory at times. I mean, particularly once you get towards the ending, there's an extent to which you could all just read the film as this was just one big slightly grim joke. Then it was just all a bit of a silly series of accidents. So as a dark comedy fan, I can get on board with that, but it is a slightly odd tone for something that's genuinely taken quite seriously.
I mean, the film does take, it kind of veers from these kind of comic moments, especially like in certain subplots. Like the son is also, like, his girlfriend's pregnant and she's a bit erratic, and the son is kind of a bit of a loser, and the mother is quite successful, the main character Elle, and then she's sort of, I don't know, a bit scornful of him, and it is quite funny. And then these things are played for laughs, but then the film can swerve really suddenly into like a very violent bit. I mean, it makes you jump a lot, which I thought was really good. Like, what it does is it, like you say, it opens with the first rape, and then at various points it like jumps back to it, and you kind of get it in more detail. Like the first time you see it, it's kind of like abridged, and then they go back and you see it in more detail, and they'll sort of suddenly jump from whatever the narrative was into this flashback really suddenly, and it really does make you, in the audience jump. And I guess which is, as you were saying, to convey the character, like she's had a traumatic experience. She's experiencing events that trigger her, and they trigger her not to remember what happened, but to relive it, which I think is part of the traumatic experience of being a rape survivor, is, being forced by events that trigger you to relive the horrible experience. And it gets that across really well, how these traumatic memories can kind of just come out of nowhere and sort of, punch you in the face, which it does. And little things like, there's one bit when she comes home to her flat and her cat just jumps into her arms, and you don't see it, but it's a big sort of, and there's like a bang on the soundtrack, and it makes you jump even though it's just a cat. Paul Verhoeven's really good at keeping you on edge, sustaining the dark tone of, with obviously the great acting of Hubert, putting you in the headspace of this character who's been, again, being triggered and experiencing these traumatic memories. And those bits that were very tense in the first half of the film I thought were really good, where the best core of the film was in these kind of really strong moments of dark tension that made you jump and feel quite unpleasant. I thought, that was some of the best bits of the film in terms of how well executed they were.
Yeah, and then he deflates it with a joke by, after the cat jumps on her, he then sort of has the character deliver a sort of withering one-liner to the cat because it didn't intervene when she was being attacked.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think even in the second half, when it went down its slightly odd little sidebar, there was a degree in which it felt like an extension to the character, like she was vaguely exploring what's going on here. Is this okay? Am I okay with this? What does this actually mean? And then she did reach a conclusion that no, it probably wasn't, before the ending happened. And again, we're in our strange world of how much do we spoil. But I think the character was sort of pushing at what has happened. What is this? I know this person. How do I reconcile this with that? What does this mean? How do I feel about that? Does this mean this is okay? And I don't know, it was odd, but I think it was something that felt like it worked within the confines of what was there, within this sort of film and its caustic main character and its weird sense of humour.
You're right, it's definitely consistent with the character, and it's consistent with the tone, but I don't know, maybe I just didn't understand, but it didn't quite ring true to me when it entered into this sort of later stage and she was having sort of this strange, like, slightly abusive affair with the man who raped her. And I mean, there's various times when I guess like you say, she was exploring whether she was okay with this or not, but she was sort of, there were times when I felt she put herself clearly in danger, which didn't seem to me believable for someone who was like a trauma survivor. They put themselves in such obvious danger to be raped again by the same person. And, I didn't find that believable. Also, I found it sort of strange what it was trying to say about the character and about the situation, because then it would also swerve back into her being fixated on what the man's been doing to her is wrong. So it's trying to tackle some really complex, difficult issues, and it does it well for tackling them head on. I just don't think I was quite believing what it had to say the whole time. I don't know, I felt it just like the degree to which the woman was kind of putting herself in danger, or, you know, wanting to be around this man who raped her. I felt, especially as she to be so intent on revenge in the early part of the film, I didn't find it completely believable, or I didn't sort of make sense of, I guess, what I understood from the character.
I don't know, I get the feeling that this is based on a book I haven't read, and a book I don't know anything about how it differs from the film. So I don't know to what extent how much plot points come from the book or the screenplay. The book is called O, apparently. But yeah, I do get the feeling there was the extent to which the writer of the story, I'm going to assume most of the story originated from the book, but who knows, tried to play off that conventional sort of survivor idea of, would it be that simple? Would they just go, oh dear, you're horrible, and then run to the police or whoever? And I think it was almost... I don't know. I mean, I don't know the oeuvre of Paul Verhoeven that well. I haven't even seen RoboCop. I watched the Mark Kermode review of this film, and he described Paul Verhoeven as an agent provocateur, so I assume he has a history of trying to be a bit controversial to provoke people.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah, I do get the feeling of that there is possibly an extent of Paul Verhoeven or the writer or someone hanging in the air going, but would it be really be like this? Is that too simplistic? I mean, fortunately, he hired a very good actress to do it, and there were some jokes. So it was still an entertaining film, and it was still captivating, and it came across as a possible viewpoint rather than just utter controversy baiting. But yeah, it was definitely a film that wanted you to feel a bit uncomfortable. And yeah, whether you like it, I guess, probably comes down to A, to what extent and in what way you felt uncomfortable, and B, whether you like being made to feel uncomfortable by your entertainment.
Yeah, I guess you're right there. And I think it certainly did make me feel uncomfortable, which is what it set out to do. And generally, I don't mind films that make me feel uncomfortable. It's unusual. I hadn't seen a film before that had made me uncomfortable around the subject of rape and sexual violence. So I don't know, maybe that's a line I don't want to cross. I mean, it certainly, like I say, the film was very good at putting you out of sorts, increasing tension, making you feel uncomfortable, as you say. And it was more subtle than just being a straight, direct provocation of, I'm going to say something, do some things and say some things that are deliberately provocative around the subject of rape to get an unpleasant emotional reaction from people. And yeah, the whole Hubert being such a great actress, I guess, really makes it work so well. And the fact it's well written and the characters are well developed. Yeah, I just found it sort of kind of confusing because I think right now we're trying to have I guess on some level, a culture. We're having a broader discussion about rape and sexual violence, how it's sometimes portrayed on film and TV, and are the responses of people believable, and also that various things like we can't use rape or sexual violence to add a sort of a gloss of edginess to a film. And this film obviously doesn't do any of these. It's not bad in that way, and it doesn't use sexual violence to add a gloss of edginess. But I do feel this film is, in some degree, confusing the waters over our wider conversation about rape and sexual violence in our culture, because there is this bit which, later on when she's sort of, again, the characters are having this kind of slightly violent rape-based affair. It's got confused messages about consent, which is something we're having a sort of a wider discussion about right now.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's aware of that in the culture to the extent that, I mean, she works at this company who make violent sort of video games, which includes a sort of a sexual tinge to the violence. Like, in the opening half hour of the film, as I remember it, roughly speaking, one of the first things she does after her assault scene is go into work to a meeting about a scene where a female character is being assaulted in her game, and order them to make her discomfort seem more orgasmic, because that's what the viewers want.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. It's definitely commentating on, the sort of some of the problems with, rape culture and a wider sort of representation of sexual violence through media. So yeah, it's aware of this and it's commenting on it at the same time.
Yeah, I think ultimately a lot of what it's saying is, but is it this simple? Would this individual woman with this background and this slightly sort of angry, brittle viewpoint take a different perspective on it? And as obviously a non-survivor, a non-woman, I have no firm position on is this 100% accurate. I thought they made it seem true to this character, but that's about it.
It was believable. Yeah, I mean, I guess I was just left feeling, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be feeling or what this is necessarily trying to say about relationships, about men, about rape.
I'm honestly not sure it has a message on that broader context beyond it's not always that simple, to be honest.
You're probably right. I mean, and like I say, films that put you outside your comfort zone, can be good things. Films that challenge your perceptions are good things. I guess, maybe I just found this to be too uncomfortable. But I'm not saying it's bad, and I'm not saying it doesn't achieve what it set out to do. I guess, it just left me feeling confused, and especially in the later halves, when in the first half it was a much more accessible, sort of tense, revenge-based thriller.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a sort of criticism and it isn't. I guess it's trying to do something complex and difficult, and it succeeds in doing a lot. I'm just not, still even, a week or so after seeing it, I'm still just not quite sure how I feel about the film and the contents, especially in the latter half.
We're going down like VHS, while the able-bodied vultures monitor and pick at us. We're going down and it's no stress. I'm laying over the knuckle-dragging exodus. We're going down like VHS.
Next up is English Tapas, the fourth studio album from Nottingham-based duo Sleaford Mods. Sleaford Mods consist of Jason Williamson rapping, singing, and often shouting over Andrew Fearn's mod bassline and synths. They're angry, often political, usually rude, and nothing like any other band that is about at the moment. I'm a big fan, but I think this is the first time, Nick, you've listened to any Sleaford Mods?
Yes, it was. I'm sure I've heard them being played in I don't know. Would I hear them being played in a bar? Maybe not. I'm sure I've heard them at some point, probably on a playlist you've made or something. But this is the first time I've actually sat down and listened to the Sleaford Mods, yeah.
Oh, cool. So, what did you think of this album?
It was fun. I was expecting something a bit more sort of evasive and political and angry based on a lot of what I've heard about them from you, to be honest. A lot of it was quite sort of... I was expecting like a blistering dismantlement of society, and instead I just got this sort of fun observational comedy vaping. Maybe comedy's a strong word. But yeah, a lot of sort of talk about shit takeaways, and even the title English Tapas is a kind of... a sort of knowing reference to like terrible English crapness, what I quite enjoy. And yeah, I could appreciate a nice sort of knowingly lame lyric, like car crash into the middle of the Magna Carta. That's a phrase that barely makes sense. But it's quite funny in a sort of, I can't believe you actually said that way. And yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed the sort of the aggressive rapping, especially when they were aggressively rapping about the silly things. The first track, like I think possibly it's a slightly front-loaded album, this specific album, in that I thought the first couple of tracks were really good, and then I thought it got quite inconsistent after that.
I preferred some of the later ones. It does sort of dip in the middle a bit. But yeah, you're right about them being humorous, certainly. I mean, there's lots of funny turns of phrases. Like in an earlier album, one of their singles began with the line, "The smell of piss was so strong it smelled like decent bacon." That's just objectively funny. So they can be quite funny, but also very serious, very angry.
Was there much angry, serious political stuff on this one?
Well, it's strange. They're kind of political in a certain sense, but in others, I mean, they're political in the sense that one of their shticks is insulting people. Insulting almost everyone, especially political establishments. They're not political in the sense they put forward any solutions or endorsements. They just sort of dismantle everything that's out there. I mean, there were definitely... I mean, this album actually was probably less political than some of their earlier ones. I think Key Markets, the previous album that came out just after or around the time of the 2015 general election, was more political. There's usually like a sort of a smashing of insults named at politicians. I mean, I think in this album they said something like, they said the Labour Party is a tube of Smarties from an airport vending machine or something like that, which is basically, I don't know, a bit crap.
I mean, this seems a bit like a sort of angry or occasionally vaguely sentimental homage to a lot of sort of shit British nights out, really, in a lot of ways. There was a song called BHS with the chorus, "We're going down like BHS," which is a fine lyric. Well done. Yeah,
that was one of my favourite songs on the album. But that is political in a sense, in that they're, BHS, there's a political connotation to this. The scandal of the collapse of BHS. I'm going to be careful what I say about that because I don't want to get sued. But yeah, they're kind of riffing on political themes. I mean, part of their main thing is kind of, like you say, observations of everyday life. Sometimes they're political. Sometimes they relate to how terrible the political situation we've ended up in is. But also sometimes they're about ordinary things like getting drunk and takeaways and sort of crap towns. I've read interviews with Jason Williamson, and he says, what he writes about is everyday life, everyday observations, and also the sort of places they get overlooked and the sort of stories and people that get overlooked in our sort of national news and our main cultural output. they're definitely kind of shining a light on things that are overlooked. Yeah, and you see that in songs about, takeouts and crap northern and Midlands towns. There's a really good song on the album called Drayton Manor.
Yes, that's one of the best songs, actually.
Yeah.
After the first couple, that was probably my favourite, I think. That and I quite like Snout as well. That and Drayton Manor.
Yeah, they're good tracks. But like Drayton Manor is about a bloke in his 40s getting pissed at home and doing coke by himself because he's got nothing better to do and doesn't really fit into the normal workings of society. And there are lots of people like that. And Jason Williamson has talked in interviews about how he's known people like that. And this is like an endemic problem of society. So he's shining a light on that, again, sort of thing that gets overlooked. But it's not suggesting it's not political and suggesting there's anything to do about this. It's more just highlighting these everyday things that get overlooked.
In many ways, it's like park life for the 21st century.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it, 21st century park life. Or he's a Midlands Kate Tempest, I suppose, to hark back to earlier in the episode.
I think I also like Drayton Manor because it had a few bits of sort of interesting bleeping noises and stuff. It sort of stood out musically a bit.
Yeah, I mean, they did say with this album they wanted to move on a bit from previous ones. In some ways, people might say, partly because Sleaford Mods don't really sound like anyone else out there. If they move on a bit, they still sound, like themselves, not like other people. But in this one, they said they wanted to think there's a bit more synth and a bit less bass and drums like there was before, and there's a bit more singing as well as rapping and shouting.
I don't know, I'm not that familiar with the old material. I did listen to a couple of the old albums, once, yesterday, just to get a vague idea of the sound. And there did seem to be a bit more sort of thumping noises and aggressive shouting in the old stuff. Whereas this one, they had a few, I don't know, I guess it's what you'd call the singing. There were a few songs which did seem to get a bit into a sort of just kind of ongoing drone. Things like Time Sands and I Feel So Wrong were a bit sort of it's sort of, this isn't grabbing me in any, there's a lack of, I don't know if the hook is a valid thing to musically say about a band like Sleaford Mods, but there didn't seem to be much of a hook.
Yeah, I Feel So Wrong is an unusual one because I think it's one when it's much more singing than they've done previously, and also I think he's trying to go for a bit more of an introspective tone rather than like an outward aggressive tone. So I think they're trying something different with that. Obviously, may not work. I do prefer the stuff when they are angry, abusive. The shouting is that's kind of the main Sleaford Mods thing. I mean, even though there's less shouting, less insults on this album, there still are quite a lot of them. They're still quite an angry, aggressive band.
Yeah, I quite liked that I managed to start listening just as they did, the second track on this album, Just Like We Do, which is the sort of, we're famous now and you're bitter about it on the internet and you're just jealous, mate, song. Which is wow, I think I've heard Robbie Williams do that one. Repeatedly.
Yeah. It's been done, but I don't know, also, it wouldn't be a Sleaford Mods album without them insulting other musicians or insulting people on the internet. It's what they do.
Yeah, at some point they said something, they did a sort of, in a mocking sort of piss-take posh voice, something about, the first season's good, but after that it's just shit, or something. Yeah, I've said that.
I think they're aware that people are going to make these comparisons about, as they make more albums, people are going to say, oh, the earlier stuff is the better stuff. They're aware of that. And I like the fact they're trying to do something different with this album, vary the tone a bit, introduce some more singing, not just do the same thing over and over, because then people are saying well, it's getting a bit dry, isn't it?
Yeah. As sort of colloquial British rapping goes, it was definitely better than Goldie Lookin Chain.
Never met or MC Pies. There was a British rapper who was a bit rubbish.
Yeah, I'm not a huge rap listener. Outside of Gorillaz, because apparently I'll only listen to any other genre if Damon Albarn is involved. But I appreciate the fact that it sounds, as sort of British hip-hop rap goes, it sounds distinctly British in its way. It does sound like something you have to be British to do, rather than British people trying to be American.
Yeah, you're definitely right. It's, the fact that he's rapping and shouting over kind of mod bass lines and drums, rather than American hip-hop that has, uses things like jazz samples or things like that. Because American hip hop especially draws on the African American musical culture and background. They started making hip hop because what they had to rap over was old jazz records and stuff. So this is British in that sense. So it draws on not only British experiences, like I say, Jason Williams tries to capture the everyday and the mundane, but also the samples and music are mod music, and that's why they're called Sleaford Mods, a very moddy bass line and drums. So that's part of British culture that it's kind of drawing on there.
Yeah, so I can appreciate that. I did come up with the Goldie Lookin Chain comparison when I first started writing my notes, but I decided it was probably cruel to actually directly compare them.
It's cool that they're from the East Midlands, as am I. It's always nice to see people from your neck of the woods doing well. I mean, it's interesting that this album, and Sleaford Mods, it seems like quite a niche thing. I mean, like an angry man shouting over some minimalist bass. It's the sort of thing you think like, oh yeah, that's only going to appeal to arty types and music snobs. But this album, and when it entered the midweek album chart at position 8, that's pretty successful. Obviously, Ed Sheeran's locked down the entire chart. Yeah, it's pretty tight right now. But it's good, there is unusual and interesting acts can still make headway. I mean, obviously, to get to number 8 in the album chart, you don't have to sell as many albums as, say, you did when, What's the Story, Morning Glory was dominating everything. But
well, I gather albums aren't really cool anymore, are they? Only really sort of oldish people who remember buying albums when they were young still buy albums.
Yeah. I bought this on day of release, so I guess I'm an oldish person who remembers when albums were cool when I was young.
Yeah, it's why sort of there's a curious lack of correlation between sort of older rock and indie acts doing quite well in the album charts and not making the slightest dent on the single chart.
I'm glad that this music is finding an audience. And it's very, it's an unusual, weirdly British thing. I mean, again, Jason Williamson has said that, Wu-Tang Clan, a big influence in him, but also, Paul Weller and The Jam. It's something very modern, very British. And you can hear, the modness in it, as well as the kind of, the influences of, rap culture that's so, aligned to America. It is a bizarrely British synthesis of weird different influences, but it is pretty cool.
Yes, and more broadly, it's nice to see a new upcoming sort of indie-ish act actually getting some buzz, because it's rare that I actually hear much mainstream excitement about any of them nowadays.
It's also good that there's some working class people making headways in music. I mean, there's been a lot written and, as you said recently, about how middle class art in general and new music is becoming. A lot of people point to Mumford & Sons, who are all from private schools and things like that. There used to be a time when, look at the Beatles. They all grew up in sort of council housing stuff. I think apart from John Lennon, all the Jam, Oasis, Joy Division. These are all bands from from poverty that had something to say. But because for various reasons, which I guess we don't really have time to go into, it's becoming much more difficult to make it as a musician. So therefore, you pretty much need some money behind you, or to be an artist in any sense. Writers, visual artists, filmmakers, you need some money behind you. So working class voices are getting crowded out. So it's good that Sleaford Mods are making some headway. I think it's no coincidence that Sleaford Mods are just breaking through now for the last couple of albums, and they're in their mid-40s, and they've been making music for a long time in various different outfits. I know Jason says he's been in punk bands and stuff over the years. And he worked in the job centre, I believe, and did odd jobs and stuff. And only till I think even after the first 2 albums had come out, he was still working in the job centre because, he needed money. He's got family and stuff he needs to support. He doesn't have money behind him, so he has to work and do music. And a lot of people can't, and family, a lot of people can't balance all of that, which is why the people who don't need to work, have money behind them, are coming through. And our culture and music has become increasingly dominated by the wealthy and people from privileged backgrounds.
Not that the Sleaford Mods are exactly competing with Ed Sheeran. But yeah, this album was alright. So it's interesting to finally get to listen to the Sleaford Mods. I don't know whether I'll be more excited to go back and listen to the old stuff a bit more, but this was definitely an interesting starting point.
If you like the Sleaford Mods, this is, a good album. It's up to the standard of their normal stuff. Maybe not my favourite Sleaford Mods album, but it's a good album. If you're at all intrigued by anything that we've said here, and I'd recommend, trying something new, go out, listen to some Sleaford Mods. Start with this album or one of the earlier albums if you prefer the angrier ones. If you want to start with the lower anger and then build up to the full screaming abuse of some of the earlier stuff, then go about it that way. But either way, I'd recommend them as an artist if you want to try something new and get a different perspective.
Shiny 80s blings, caught blind me, I can't see it, bollocks. They have to rely on showbiz nodders, like fake London genius, pretty shit. First season was alright, but that's about it. You like music that much, then start fucking listening to it, deep down.
Finally, this episode, we will be looking at Michael Mann's cult crime thriller Heat, starring Robert De Niro as Neil McCauley, a professional thief, and Al Pacino as Vincent Hanna, the cop that is determined to bring him down. The film is mostly remembered as the first time where Al Pacino and Robert De Niro appeared in the same scene together. It was recently screened at the BFI, and we went down to see it. Nick, what did you think?
On the one hand, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's good, sort of individual bits. Like, Michael Mann's definitely very good with the camera. It's never short of nice things to look at. The sort of moody portrayal of the urban environments, the action scenes. There's particularly good, like the film as a whole is a sort of cops and robbers heist film. It opens with a big heist scene, then there's a lot of investigation, then there's another big heist, and then after that, I think the rest of the film is about the aftermath of that second big heist, I guess. And the performances are all very good, especially, obviously, as you said, there's Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. And they're both, especially Al Pacino, but both of them are very sort of aggressively acting in a very sort of moody looks kind of way. It feels like both a strength and a weakness to me. It feels like a film that exists as a vehicle for these two great men. And as someone who sort of skips that whole era of film and isn't sufficiently in love with Pacino and De Niro for the entire film to be made just by watching them look moody, it makes it kind of slow at times, especially as it is 3 hours long, which... But most of my complaints basically end up spiralling back round to the running time. I don't really see why this film is so long, to be honest. It's a very sort of enjoyable, intense sort of cops and robbers storyline, but I admit it might be a bit compacted in an hour and a half, but I'm pretty sure there's a much better 2-hour film here struggling to get out.
I guess the case for it being so long is that what Michael Mann does is he tries to give his characters like a sort of rich inner life and sort of, you know, they're fully developed, realised characters, much like we were saying about Elle and the main character in that. This film, I guess, he's taking the two iconic cinema roles of a cop and a robber, and then as well as the kind of the cat and mouse between the two of them, you get the life of each one. You know, you get the whole realised sort of, you know, life of each character, and then that's kind of played out to take this film from beyond just an iconic cop and robber story into something that seems like, you know, this is what it could be like in real life.
I think that's kind of the problem for me, though. It's like, for it to justify being 3 hours long, it needs to go beyond being a sort of pulpy cop and robber storyline and, like, transcend. It doesn't really ever transcend for me. It just feels like what should have been a sort of a snappy pulp story that's just going on a long time. I mean, Pacino and De Niro are good. Their characters are kind of... They're pretty archetypal, aren't they? I mean, Elle sort of takes your expectations and subverts it back and forth and just generally beats you around the head with, this is not what you expect. This woman has a difficult character that you have to grapple and reckon with. Pacino is, although he's definitely acting it, he's very much a standard cop on the edge, and even De Niro is just a sort of general stoic mafia boss, isn't he? Or crime boss. We don't really get into their history. We don't really get even deep into their motivations, to be honest. I mean, Pacino is neglecting his wife because he's a cop on the edge who doesn't like crime. Considering that's the characterisation of every cop in every film, I'm not sure it needed the extra hour.
I suppose the sense is that you don't get... you do kind of mention bits and pieces of their backstory come into it, but I think it's not trying to like lay out like a sort of a timeline of their life. I mean, I think there's a certain approach to detailed characterisation which kind of goes, basically at some point we're going to stop the plot and throw in everything that's happened in this character's life up to that point. I mean, if you look at the Marvel TV shows, they all seem to do this, in that, you know, Daredevil, Jessica Jones and Luke Cage all have a bit when they kind of halfway through they kind of stop and go, right, we're going to go back to the beginning and fill in. So there's one approach which is like laying out like a timeline of this character's life to create like a fully realised person. But I think what they're going for this is more not trying to fill in necessarily the backstory, but trying to build out what the character's like now. I mean, you could argue that this is done poorly because if it just repeats the same scenes over and over, but basically showing the same interaction between, not the same interaction, but showing more detail how these characters interact in the present to kind of give you a sort of, to hint at what's going on beneath the surface. So I know Michael Mann is someone who really likes to build up and create like very detailed characters, create detailed backstories and histories for their characters, but then not necessarily bring that into the film, just have it kind of there in the performances and in the way the characters interact. So I think that's what he was trying to do in this film, show the kind of the detail of the character in the present.
Yeah, it didn't really come through that strongly for me. They both felt like quite sort of... But they're very strong presences in a sort of... like a tight crime film. They would have been very good because they'd have filled the screen quite nicely. I wouldn't have needed to, I wouldn't have felt they were weak. But for a film that, if it is meant to be building itself so heavily on characterisation, a lot of the characters outside Pacino and De Niro were, even by film supporting character standards, a bit sort of nothingy. I mean, De Niro's love interest is pretty bad.
I mean, there's not a lot of her character.
Pretty much the only things I remember thinking that this seems a bit age inappropriate, and then that was it, really. It just sort of went on.
She doesn't have much of a role. Well, which is unfortunate. She just sort of exists to propel the Rob De Niro character in a certain direction. She doesn't have much of a life in her own right. It's just more that like the Rob De Niro character has a credos and a way that he lives so that he can be a professional thief. His ethos is he doesn't have baggage or anything that slows him down because he needs to be able to be as flexible as possible to do his job. And then she comes along and complicates matters. I mean, she doesn't have a particularly complex character or much of a life of her own. I guess she does exist just to kind of disturb the equilibrium of the De Niro character.
But yeah, I felt like it was a shame she didn't have like a stronger personality, or they didn't, write some more sort of memorable, exciting romance scenes for the two of them. Because then I might have bought a bit more into this is a change to the equilibrium instead of just, oh, she's there.
Yeah.
But yeah, and yet another underwritten female character tries to kill herself towards the end. Again, considering that's what a genuine big dramatic move, I could have felt they could have given that a bit more build-up in the 3 hours that they had.
Yeah, that was played by Natalie Portman before she was quite as famous as she is now. She'd been in Leon, I think, before Heat, but it's an early Natalie Portman performance. Yeah, I mean, they do try to build up her character as someone who's suffering from depression. She's the sort of stepdaughter of the Al Pacino cop. Again, she kind of sort of exists to disturb the equilibrium of the Al Pacino character. I suppose the female supporting parts are definitely underwritten. The one that is, I thought, quite good was one of the other characters is played by Val Kilmer, the part of his wife.
Yes, she was good, actually. I've got a note for her as well. Yeah, actually, she was definitely by some way the best sort of female part in it, even though they are basically all, well, there's 3 love interests and someone's daughter, but yeah, she was good. She made some decisions, she did some things, she had a few good bits of like tense interaction with the police.
Yeah, and she had a good dilemma, which is that she wants out of the criminal life that her husband and the Robert De Niro character exist in. She wants out, but part of the price of escaping is betraying her husband, and so there's a good moral dilemma, and there's, obviously won't spoil what happens, but yeah, there's when she has to make a decision.
Yes, I mean, I think the only other Michael Mann film I've seen is Collateral, which I do actually really like. Well, it was only 2 hours long, to harken back to the main point, and I think it did quite a good job of deftly giving the characters a few key points and then just going from there into quite a tight plot.
Heat has a lot of the distinctive Michael Mann elements that Collateral has as well. It's like mainly shot on location, the camera work is really good, it's quite up close to the characters. I think Michael Mann shot a lot of Heat himself. He actually got behind the camera and not only directed but was actually filming it. It's got sort of great sort of stark action scenes. One of the things I love about Michael Mann is he likes to use the genuine sounds of things, because like a lot of times in films they create artificial sounds that are supposed to sound like the real thing. The obvious one is gunshots. Usually they use artificial gunshots in film and TV, which is why it's weird when you hear gunshots on the news, they sound different.
Yeah.
And one of the things I do like about Michael Mann is that he uses real life gunshot sounds. So the kind of core set piece of Heat, probably the best bit, is the big bank heist in the middle that ends up in the shootout between the cops and the robbers in the street. And it's just the sounds, like it really brings home how dangerous it is when they're trying to fighting amongst the public, because like the guns sound loud, and when every time they fire you can hear it echo like around the buildings, and like it's scrappy and disorganized, chaotic, and really intense. Brilliant scene, really well directed. Yeah, there's that kind of those touches of realism that Michael Mann brings to something.
Yeah, that was great. If there had been more exciting spectacle and less sort of endless, slightly repetitive talking, then I would probably like this film more. The 2 big action sequences were great.
Yeah, and he uses sound in a really interesting way, like the gunshots. So the final confrontation takes place near an airport, and you have this kind of rhythmic sounds of like planes passing overhead every so often. He just plays around with sound in a really interesting way and creates atmosphere really strongly.
Yeah, that was a lovely looking final bit. Although it was, again, considering he had 3 hours, I'm apparently going to keep harping on this. It's just slightly disappointing that Pacino and De Niro only got like 2 scenes together, only one of which they actually spoke. I know that that's, it's one of these things where I think, watching it slightly outside the context and not really caring about the mythology of these 2 actors, you could have given your main 2 stars more time to bounce off each other. Just one scene. I mean, I appreciate you don't want to completely rob it of the magic, but the one scene seemed a bit, surely you could have stretched to 2 or 3.
Yeah, I mean, it was a big deal when it happened at the time, and it still remains like an iconic scene within cinema. I guess if you haven't got if you're not bought into the mythology of these 2 sort of the 2 greatest actors in cinema at the moment are going to like share a scene, then I can see why the impact wouldn't be as great.
It was a good scene. There was some quality intensity. It was just, it mostly made me wish that they'd spoken before that, and also that they spoke again at some point after. Yeah, it's an interesting film to have seen, but a bit rambly for me to watch for pleasure. I felt like the sheer length, the characterization needed to go into a bit more detail. If you're going to do the sort of deft, a few notes characters, then that usually works better in a sort of tighter plot. Yeah. For me, anyway.
Yeah, it is quite a sprawling film, much like LA itself. It does really photograph LA very well, although it has done nothing to dissuade me of the fact that Los Angeles seems to be about 80% roads. And sort of quite ugly buildings that stand next to roads. But it's quite a sprawling film. It's quite slow. It's like the music is like kind of 80s synth way, sort of a low kind of rumble in the background, a bit like the Blade Runner soundtrack, which does that really well. I can see why if you're not, sold on the mythology of the actors or into the films that I guess are done in this sort of sprawling, sort of trying to be like a modern epic, I guess like some of the John Ford films of the past, although they were shorter. I like what it's trying to do, but maybe it's the sort of thing that really appeals to like serious cinephiles in that, because it's got like all these kind of visual references and it's create this kind of big expansive film. I mean, most people I know who are like really into cinema very much are kind of like, oh yeah, it's a classic, but maybe that's because it's a film made for people who are into films. Whereas if you haven't, like say, bought into the kind of, like as you said, the mythology around this film, I can see maybe how you would just come across as it's quite long and quite slow.
A lot of it's execution. I mean, Taxi Driver is arguably quite long and quite slow, but that was fine. That was good. I liked that because that really, it really did dig very long and hard into the Robert De Niro character in that film. Whereas in this case, I didn't really feel like it dug that hard into the characters, and I didn't feel like there was enough like fast-moving action to distract me from the fact it wasn't digging that hard into the characters.
Yeah, it's good to know. We shall bear that in mind for future references. Maybe one of my less successful recommendations, but I'm glad that we got to grapple with Heat and the issues that it raised. So, for next episode, what are you going to recommend to me?
Well, similar to when we did Rick and Morty a while back, this is something I've been watching recently and thought it would be fun to talk about on the podcast rather than something that I've loved since I was a teenager. This is the series Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, which is on Netflix in the UK and I think on the CW in the US, which stars Rachel Bloom as Rebecca Bunch, a lawyer who suffers from what appears to be some sort of low-level breakdown whilst working at an intense job in New York and ends up moving to a small town in California because her ex-boyfriend lives there, although she will of course heavily deny that. It's a funny show, it's also a musical, it's possibly a slight abuse of the recommendation function, in that I'm not 100% sure it's entirely your sort of thing, but I'm interested to talk about it.
I have heard people talking about this show, and there's a lot of interesting discussion going on around it, so I'm certainly interested to see it, and I guess we'll find out next time what I specifically thought.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's got some good bits about mental illness, it's got some comedy songs, we'll see. Okay, and that's all your moderate fantasy violence for this fortnight. Thank you for listening as ever. And also as ever, if you're enjoying the show, do consider reviewing us on iTunes because it does greatly help us grow and find new listeners and other good positive things. And you can also subscribe on iTunes or on Stitcher, where you can also review us as well. There's a whole review subscribe back and forth going on there. Or you can go to our website at moderatefantasyviolence.com where you can download all our episodes, read our articles, listen to our deleted scene type things under excessive fantasy violence and all that other good stuff.
You can also follow us on social media. If you go to Twitter, we are at MFV Podcast. On Facebook, we are Moderate Fantasy Violence. If you just search for that, you'll see our lovely purple logo, and you can follow us there. I've been Alastair Ball. You can follow me on Twitter at AlastairJRBall, and you can read more of my writing at redtrainblog.com. If you do follow me on Twitter after hearing this, do give me a shout out. It's always been nice to talk to fans of the podcast. Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what you think about the show so far.
I've been Nick Bryan. You can find me on Twitter as @NickMB. You can talk to me as well if you like. And I also have a website blog thing at nickbryan.com where I talk about my self-published crime books and occasionally other things. So we'll be back in 2 weeks probably. Certainly we'll let you know on social media if the schedule changes, where we'll be covering Power Rangers, possibly with a special guest, and the new Marvel Netflix show Iron Fist, and we'll be seeing what Alastair thought of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. Okay, and that really is it. Bye.
Bye. But either way, I'd recommend them as an artist. If you want to try something new and get a different perspective.
In it,
bruv.
Yeah, I'll leave that in for sure.
No, don't.
But
It's my Ali G impression.
Yeah, he's definitely still relevant. The kids probably don't even know who he is anymore, to be honest.
So I feel deeply depressed as a generation of people who growing up not being aware of Ali G. They don't know what they're missing out on.
God, I'm jealous of them.